Okay, Darren, are we recording yet?
Yeah, we're good to go.
All right, great. Great. Can you guys see my screen?
I can't see it right now.
Let's see, it says it's sharing my window. So you can't see the first slide deck? The
Okay.
first slide?
I do have one attendee that says he can't see it, so I think we're good.
Oh, okay. Cool. And just confirming, Thornton, can you see the screen okay? Thornton, you there?
Yes, I responded in chat. I made it.
Okay. Great. All right, we'll get started. Okay, guys. Well, thanks for joining today's webinar. Today we're going to be talking about creating HIPAA compliant infrastructure and the same time saving time, reducing your overhead. I just want to make some quick introductions. The presenters today will be myself, Zach Fierstadt. I'm one of the principals here at Lightcrest. I've been at Lightcrest since 2008. I head up business development, and we'll also be joined by Thornton Prime, who's our expert in compliance, security, and storage, and hails from companies that you may have heard of like Quantum and Amgen, and he has a lot of experience of winning HIPAA compliance and building cloud infrastructure that adheres to stringent compliance regimes. So while I'm assuming many of you already know what HIPAA is, I do want to just set a little bit of background and definition for folks who may not be so familiar with HIPAA, but may be dealing with HIPAA in the near future for their infrastructure initiatives. So HIPAA is, an acronym that stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and it was basically passed by Congress in '96 to establish a body of standards to increase health insurance continuity, reduce fraud, and establish rules for securely storing, transmitting, and maintaining electronic protected health information, or EPHI. I won't dive into it any further than that, other than saying that at Lightcrest, what we really focus on is helping customers secure their EPHI data and build cloud architectures that are conducive to easily passing HIPAA audits. So, if you're wondering kind of where we sit in the scope of HIPAA, generally we're going to be talking about the security provisions, or at least the infrastructures that speak to the security provisions of Title II. And our goal today is really to show you at a high level, the pros and cons of various cloud architectures and how you can gain the most control over your own HIPAA compliance in the cloud. A little bit more about just sort of who's required to adhere to HIPAA. Basically, anyone who's quote unquote a covered entity, right, is mandated to adhere to HIPAA. So that includes healthcare clearinghouses, healthcare plans, and healthcare providers. And even if you don't fall into that category, you still might be required to adhere to HIPAA, right? So business associates usually have less EPHI than covered entities. But if your organization provides services to a HIPAA-covered entity as a business associate, you are very likely to have to also adhere to HIPAA. So the sort of mandate of adhering to this compliance regime is touching a lot of organizations, even folks who are directly dealing with EPHI. So it's very important to make sure that if any of your customers you're asking you to sign a business associate, you understand the implications of HIPAA and what that means for your cloud infrastructure. So I want to talk a little bit about a private cloud, and I want to talk a little bit about Lightcrest. So at Lightcrest, we specialize in building bespoke private and hybrid cloud infrastructure. The vast majority of our customers are deployed in private clouds, and we've built a product called Kahu, which is essentially a software-defined hyper-converged data center product that helps customers get as much value as possible out of private cloud infrastructure. And I want to talk about what a private cloud actually is, right? Because when it comes to security and maintaining a very small attack surface and making sure that your compliance, your HIPAA compliance is up to spec with exactly what your auditor expects, private cloud is very conducive to maintaining complete control and increasing your probability of passing an audit. The reason why that is the defining characteristic of a private cloud is single tenancy, right? So what that means is in a private cloud, the underlying physical resources, the hypervisors, the physical hardware, all of that is dedicated 100% to you. There's no other businesses, other customers on that cloud besides you. And what that means is not only do you get better performance, and we'll dive into some of that stuff in a little bit, but you get much more control over your security. So let's talk about that a little bit. So when you're evaluating cloud solutions, and especially when you're evaluating cloud solutions with the sort of notion that you will be eventually be asked to pass an audit for HIPAA, you're going to be looking at all kinds of architectures. You're going to be looking at public cloud. You might be looking at vendors like Microsoft Azure or AWS. You might be looking at building your own VMware solution, whatever it is. It's very important to sort of outline the pros and cons of these architectures, and fundamentally, what we'd like to articulate today is sort of it's not just about the security benefits that are directly related to your cloud architecture, but it's also what are the costs associated with maintaining compliance adherence in any one of these environments. So I want to talk about security and getting better security, right? So in general, a private cloud is going to provide you with better security than a public cloud for a multitude of reasons. I want to focus on one of the primary ones first. So in a public cloud, you are sharing underlying hypervisors with other customers, right? This is a fundamental implication that you should be aware of when you're looking at defining your security policies, because no matter how hard you try to minimize your attack surface on your virtual machines, on your guest operating systems, on your virtual network devices, your neighboring, your neighbors on your hypervisors in the public cloud they have their own security policies, right? So as an example, on AWS, your VM is on a hypervisor that's shared with many other customers that you don't know who they are, and you don't know what their security policies are. You don't know if they're great at securing their guest operating systems or if they're horrible at it. And what that fundamentally means is no matter how hard you try to secure your virtual machines, if one of your neighbor's VMs gets compromised, gets hacked, and you share a hypervisor with them, your hypervisor is impacted. So even if that customer's VM is compromised and the attacker doesn't get root access to the hypervisor that you share, they can spawn a DDoS attack. They can attempt to break into neighboring virtual machines like yours. They can steal data and sniff traffic. And these are things that you need to be aware of because they are fundamentally out of your control, right? The other thing you need to be aware of on a public cloud is when you launch VMs on most public clouds, you are basically exposing virtual machines to the public internet at large. On a private cloud, particularly in private clouds that are deployed in bespoke environments, you have much more control over your default network policies, and you are basically given the flexibility to minimize your attack surface. And we'll dive into some of that stuff in a little bit. So a little bit about performance. So what we see in the wild right now is on the public cloud, it's great initially when you're starting a business or you really don't know what your initial workload size is going to be. You're still sizing your applications. You're still seeing how much traffic your end users are going to consume. And the public cloud is great when you're starting out because you can start very small and scale up very quickly. The issue is once you've established a baseline of traffic and you start getting into levels of throughput where you're running a profitable growing business and you've got 10, 15, 20 plus virtual machines at that sort of scale, you start the convenience premium associated with public cloud starts really to add up. So the per unit cost of virtual machines in the public cloud is high, and because you're sharing underlying resources with other customers in the public cloud, you have to compensate for stolen CPU cycles, stolen network throughput, stolen I/O. You have to compensate for that by adding more and more virtual machines. So it's not just that public cloud is less performant than private cloud, which is true. It's that because of those performance implications, the costs tend to increase very quickly. So what are the implications of this on HIPAA? Well, performance, is not really something that's going to be defined in the HIPAA body of standards as well. You need the best possible user experience. You need really fast computers and really fast storage. It's not really going to be there. But what is important is that where you have data encryption happening, where you have SSL happening, where you have any sort of encryption being employed, where speed is key, and again encryption is CPU intensive. That's going to matter to you, right? So the more performance you have, the more you can dedicate to operations that are going to increase your levels of data protection and security. And we also want to talk about information assurance, right? So in a private cloud, you have information assurance. And so what is information assurance? Information assurance is knowing exactly where your data lives at all times and knowing who has access to that data. That is not something you're going to get in the public cloud. And the reason for that is in the public cloud, your data infrastructure is abstracted away from you. You might know that you're in an availability zone in Seattle or Virginia, and you might know approximately what city it's in and the geographic location, but you're not going to be able to know what servers inside the public cloud your data actually lives on, down to the rack and the cage and the location in the data center and down to the personnel who have access to it, right? If you want to get a list of all the individuals who have had access to your physical hypervisors where your VMs live in the public cloud, that's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to get because the public cloud is not designed to give you that kind of information. So in a private cloud, by contrast, your physical infrastructure is not only dedicated to you, it is in a very specific location in cabinets and cages where, given you're working with the right provider, you can get an audit trail of exactly which personnel at what times have gotten physical access to your cage and ultimately to your data, right? So information assurance is huge, especially in the federal arenas and in arenas where compliance that requires very tight data security is paramount, right? So if you're going to be looking at a HIPAA audit and your auditor wants to know who's had access to your data, the private cloud is going to make managing those audit trails much easier, and in many cases it's going to give you a leg up when you're talking to customers, because your customers are going to want to ask you, where's the data located, who has access to it. You're going to be able to give them a very firm answer. So cost is also huge, right? Because it's not going to do you any good to align yourself with a provider where maybe they've got great security packages, maybe they don't, but at the end of the day, it's also a very expensive place to be, because if it is not a cost-efficient place to be long-term, you're going to have to move, and then you're going to have to reevaluate security policies at the new provider, right? So when you're looking at private versus public in particular, private clouds tend to be significantly more cost-effective at scale for two reasons. One, private clouds are 100% dedicated to you. That means you need less total virtual machines to achieve the same levels of performance and workload capacity than you would on a public cloud. As I mentioned earlier, on the public cloud, you get this concept of this sort of virtual machine sprawl, whereby you compensate for stolen CPU cycles, RAM, and network throughput by adding more and more VMs. And all those VMs add up to a much bigger bill. But the other main thing you really need to consider when you're evaluating private versus public cloud is how you are capitalizing the infrastructure. In public cloud, for example, AWS or Microsoft Azure or GCE, you're paying rent forever. You're never not going to be paying them rent. And if you are in a business where you are only going to be growing, say for the next 5 years or 3 years, it doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense to continue to pay rent. It's like owning a house versus renting an apartment. When you're renting an apartment, you're kind of just throwing money in the furnace, right? With a private cloud, since the infrastructure is 100% dedicated to you, you have the ability to capitalize that infrastructure and own it, right? And we'll dive into some of those details later, but I just want you to keep that in mind because it is a significant benefit when you're evaluating what goes hand in hand with HIPAA, right? Because if private clouds are more conducive to security, are going to give you a better chance at passing your audit, it's a very nice bonus that you're going to be able to couple that with a better capitalization model to lower your cloud costs. So I want to be very fair here, right? People ask, can a public cloud be HIPAA compliant? We by no means want to leave the impression that a public cloud cannot be HIPAA compliant. In fact, many of the top cloud vendors are getting very aggressive about high trust and HIPAA and other compliance regimes. And the short answer is yes, absolutely. You can be HIPAA compliant in a public cloud. The question is not so much, can you be compliant at all in these environments? The question is, how is the complexity and abstraction of public cloud going to impact your ability to maintain compliance and maintain a stringent security policy and stringent set of controls? From our experience, public cloud in many ways adds to the complexity of maintaining a holistic security policy and can actually increase the costs of maintaining HIPAA compliance. And we'll dive into some of those details in a bit here. And I also don't want to leave the impression that not all private clouds are HIPAA compliant out of the box, right? I mean, private clouds are definitely structured in such a way as to decrease the heartburn and costs associated with good security policies and HIPAA compliance, but it's not going to be HIPAA compliant out of the box. You're going to need to work with a set of experts or a vendor that specifically tunes your private cloud to the HIPAA body of standards, whether it comes to how the data is encrypted or the data is stored and archived, all those things. So let's talk about what makes a private cloud HIPAA compliant, right? There's no definitive checklist you're going to get from the U.S. Department of Health and Services that you can attach to a clipboard, tick off all the boxes, and once you've got those boxes ticked, you're HIPAA compliant. That's not how it works. What you have to do is prepare the best you can, prepare the documentation, prepare the architecture, implement the architecture, and get all the standard operating procedures done correctly far in advance of your audit. And once you pass your audit, you will have essentially acted within compliance. There's no magic bullet. There's no silver bullet to just getting compliant. So as a company like Crest, we have no sort of illusions around this. And when we speak to folks who are looking to get HIPAA compliant, we really try to impress the sense that look, it's critical that you work with not just a vendor but a partner who's going to help you navigate the compliance landscape and architect you a solution that is going to prepare you well in advance of an audit. So we'll dive into some of that stuff as well. So what makes a private cloud HIPAA compliant, right? Let's talk a little bit about physical architecture. So information assurance is key to your cloud environment if you're going to be under audit, right? So where is your data located? Who physically has access to the data? How is your data destroyed? The personnel that are deploying and destroying the data, how are they rotated in and out of the access list in the data center? Are there offsite backups? Where are they located, right? These are all, sort of physical and locality, type attributes that must be taken into account far in advance of your audit. In a HIPAA compliant environment, you're going to want the ability to show an auditor exactly who has physical access to the cages and the cabinets associated with your infrastructure, when they access the environment, correlated timestamps with, biometric hand scanning, down to the second, right? So, I want the ability to tell my auditor, hey, on Tuesday of last week, I can generate, a set of timestamped log entries that show exactly which engineers and personnel had direct access to my cloud serving up EPHI data. So this is particularly difficult, as we mentioned, to do in a public cloud because all that stuff is abstracted away from you. Our approach to this at Lightcrest is essentially we deploy all of our customers physical Kahu bricks, which are the hypervisors, in tier 3 data center locations that are built to provide these audit trails. So when you're looking at your physical architecture and you're looking at man traps and surveillance and various data center tiers, it can be an overwhelming thing to consider, along with the entire raft of other HIPAA compliance procedures you need to follow just at the business level, right? So we really recommend that if you don't have the in-house data center expertise to solve for the physical architecture component, you really work with a vendor to partner with you on this. So a little bit about logical architecture as pertains to HIPAA compliance. So HIPAA mandates that you have explicit control over all your EPHI data, and wherever it's shared, that data cannot be seen by non-authorized personnel, right? So in a private cloud, securing EPHI data is easier because you have complete control of the security practices in your environment. But there's still a lot of questions to ask, right? There's a lot of work to do. So things like, will your backups be stored on a dedicated or shared virtual machine or server? If your data is going to be in a shared backup server or shared backup environment, what encryption algorithms and ciphers are you going to use to secure that data so that other customers can't see it? Are you going to be using dedicated storage VLANs? What about the security of your offsite backups if you have a DR or business continuity plan? These are all things that you need to take into consideration, and the entire concept of maintaining sort of an IT security center of excellence in your organization can be not only daunting, but from a dollars and cents standpoint, just ludicrous, right? Most organizations today, especially software as a service companies who are dealing in EPHI data or have customers that are covered entities, they're not going to have a chief security officer and a set of experts in house to figure out firewall DMZs, ACL policies, VPN endpoints, all the stuff that's going to be critical to passing your audit, right? So most of the time when we talk to customers who are looking at their logical architecture as it pertains to HIPAA, we say, look, don't worry about the details in the body of standards. Let us look at how we're going to use our existing reference architectures to speed things up, and then we'll tune those to your environment. So another thing to keep in mind is that compliance doesn't end with your cloud architecture, right? You need to be able to provide documented procedures and controls to your auditor, and nothing says I'm prepared better than a proper risk register and set of SOP documents or standard operating procedure documents for administering your cloud. And for those of you that don't know, a risk register is essentially documentation and a histogram, if you like, that rates your environment relative to the risks that you perceive to be present. And even if you tally all the risks, and some of the risks show that maybe you haven't scored yourself so well in the area of administrative cloud control, or you haven't scored yourself so well in the area of end-to-end application encryption, right? At least you have the attack surface and the actual full spectrum of risks documented, so that when it comes time for audit, let's say you have an audit scheduled 2 or 3 months from now, you have a complete picture and you know where to focus your energy. Because if you don't have a situation where you've documented everything and you don't have a risk register, you're essentially going to be starting from scratch, and you could potentially focus a lot of your time on the wrong things and then fail your audit. So at Lightcrest, what we really try to do is, when we're talking about the security provision of the HIPAA body of compliance, is provide customers with a risk register that we know works for the 80% use case. We tailor that to their business model, and then we ensure that customers have full purview into where they're at risk and where Lightcrest can ratchet up their levels of compliance and security where they're most exposed. So a little bit about physical controls. I talked about some of this stuff in physical architecture because data centers are related to physical architecture and physical controls are related to physical architecture, but there is a specific drill down, if you will, into physical security, which is the ability to tailor specific controls and policies as they pertain to your physical security, right? So, for example, in your current data center, do you have the ability to request surveillance footage for the last 3 days? Do you have the ability to request a locked cabinet door for the front and back of your private cloud infrastructure cabinet, so that only specific authorized personnel can access the cabinet where your servers live? Do you have the ability to dig up compliance certifications from your current data center, whether that be ISO or SSAE Type 2 or SAS? Do you have the ability to essentially change the access control list into the physical location? Do you have a rapport with your data center such that they will essentially get you anything you need in the event of an audit that speaks to biometric hand scanning or power consumption or man traps, right? These are all things that, if you are not in a high-grade facility, chances are you're not going to get any of that stuff. So it does make a lot of sense if you want to impress your auditor, impress your customers, win more business where EPHIs can be critical, or you're going to be talking about covered entities in the sales cycle. They're going to be asking these kinds of questions, and not only is it critical to increasing your chance of passing a HIPAA audit, it's going to help you land more business in general. So I want to talk about network controls as well, and this is a pretty large topic, and we obviously don't have a lot of time to talk about network controls. There's something that I want to make clear about our philosophy here at Lightcrest, which is having a sound network security, network control policy is, if not the most important thing, one of the most important things you can do to decrease the heartburn associated with HIPAA compliance audit. Network security is the first line of defense, right? So it doesn't matter if you've got great OS security and patching schedules. It doesn't matter if your application developers are writing super secure code. If your network policy is lax, your stuff is exposed from day one, right? So nothing is going to make your HIPAA audit easier than having a block first, ask questions later approach. As you may be aware, on public clouds, a lot of the default network policies are, launch 10 virtual machines and all 10 of those have public IP addresses, right? That means you have to be concerned about direct exposure when it comes to new services as they come up on the virtual machines, and all of the traffic directed at that public cloud is publicly routable and going to hit your servers, right? So your attack surface is immediately just brought and exposed, versus on a private cloud, done right, all of your infrastructure is on private RFC 1918 address space, and you can't even route packets to your private cloud, right? So, just think about it. If your private cloud environment is totally private IP space, and the only entry points into that environment are through specific conduits like, lockdown load balancer VIPs, or, firewall DMZs with explicitly defined, set of NAT addresses and whitelist remote access. Right away, what you get is a situation where you are only really initially concerned with securing the exposed services in that environment, right? So if you're only explicitly allowing a very small amount of services and your private cloud is not even, physically accessible from the public routed internet, or logically accessible from the publicly routed internet, you've cut down the amount of work you have to do when you're preparing for an audit, and you can focus all your energy on the parts that are exposed, right? I'm not going to have to, worry about, checking off all my superfluous, TCP and UDP services that are launched on my VMs at the gate if those aren't even exposed, right? And certainly, you still need to be very cognizant of other security procedures like, encrypting your data in the back end and storing things on the right back end VLANs, et cetera. But at the end of the day, a good sound network policy is going to reduce the amount of work you have to do and ultimately reduce the costs of preparing for an audit and passing an audit. So a little bit about cloud controls. The promise of cloud was this sort of, you get the ability to launch VMs on demand, you get automation through APIs, it's very easy to just push a button and boom, out comes, a bunch of infrastructure that you need. And that's all great stuff. And it's critical that folks do leverage those advances and innovations in cloud technology. But it also provides one more entry point for attackers to compromise the system, right? So I'll give you a perfect example. One of our customers who just came to Lightcrest came from Amazon Web Services, and their primary security gripe was that there was a credential leak leading to compromise of their portal. This resulted in an attacker breaking into their administrative cloud portal, essentially, gaining access to their virtual machines, which is a whole can of worms in itself, right? Because now the data EPHI is essentially compromised. But it also resulted in the attacker launching, hundreds of virtual machines without permission. And this was a huge problem, right? Their cloud bill went through the roof. They had to deal with the data breach, and they had to, essentially reissue credentials and keys across the board. So yes, it's fantastic that cloud exists and that these cloud entry points exist, but it also provides just one more entry point, and potentially a very dangerous one because of the automation, right, associated with this stuff. Attacker can very easily automate tons and tons of provisioning through these cloud controls. So it's critical that when you're looking at various cloud environments, how does that provider handle the storage and distribution of credentials, right? How does that provider handle the means by which users access the cloud provisioning, the APIs, the keys, things like that. And private cloud, in particular, we think is a much better way to approach the situation, especially if the product you're using, the product that you're using supports multiple tenancies for authorization, right? So with our product, Kahu, what we tend to do is in the production quote unquote tenancy, and when I say tenancy, I mean just the sort of isolation of virtual machines, not other businesses. It's still dedicated to one organization, but with our versions of essentially tenancies, we don't give anyone in the organization access to the administrative controls for the public infrastructure, right? So all the keys and credentials associated with your specific cloud portal are stored with us. So it's on us to make sure there isn't a leakage of your credentials, and as you can imagine, the fewer people who have access to your credentials, the less likely there's going to be a leak, right? So it tends to be a much more tractable policy to manage access to cloud controls. So a little bit about backup, recovery, and archive. So business continuity and disaster recovery, right? I mean, you're talking about the ability to data center one goes down, data center two can take over. You've got defined RPO and RTOs, you have the ability to recover from complete data center outage, et cetera, et cetera. And DR and business continuity are at the heart of most folks' cloud strategies, and the level of DR and business continuity that you get are a function of cost and business requirements, right? These all vary to some degree, but there is a big impact to your HIPAA compliance when you're looking at differences in strategy, right? So you need to think about how is your EPHI going to be backed up, right? In a public cloud, most likely your EPHI is going to be on shared infrastructure, right? So if you're backing up data into an object store like S3, or if you're looking at block storage on EBS, something like that, all that stuff is shared, and you need to think about every single time someone spins up more storage in a public cloud, are they spinning up storage that is aligned with the security policies? Is there encryption at rest on the underlying storage? Is the data encrypted end to end from the client to the backend backup server? Is the data encrypted before it goes into an object store, right? And are all the folks in your organization, including your developers, trained on how to make sure that you are not breaching compliance as they spin up more and more infrastructure in the public cloud, right? And these are things that have become increasingly hard to control and increasingly more expensive to control when everybody in your organization has the ability to spin up stuff on the fly, right? Compared with the private cloud, where ideally when you're working with someone like Lightcrest, the vendor is 100% responsible for the backup and data storage security policies, right? So instead of all your developers and ops people spinning stuff up and hoping that they're adhering to the policies, you just kind of abstract yourself away from that and lean on the vendor to do it for you. And this means that not only did you spend less time worrying about that stuff, you have to essentially point the finger at your vendor and say, hey, this is on you guys. We don't, if there's a breach, it's completely on you to let me know why that happened, right? I mean, it's not my developer's problem anymore. So this is all stuff you want to take into consideration. This is particularly where I think MSPs tend to shine a lot for enterprises, because backup and recovery is a huge headache, especially for folks who have high data velocity, where they're accumulating terabytes and terabytes upon data. The exposure risk just tends to increase proportionally with the amount of data that you have, right? So it makes a lot of sense, especially if you want to focus on your core product capabilities, driving new revenue in your organization. You really don't want to be worrying about this stuff yourself. So we're going to speed things up a little bit, and I just want to talk a little bit about things you should be wary of as you assess the cloud landscape, the service provider landscape when it comes to secure and HIPAA compliant private cloud solutions. You should be aware of anybody who's trying to sell you quote unquote compliance as a service. The vast majority of solutions providers, service providers, MSPs are not going to give you a certificate that says you're HIPAA compliant. And if they have quote unquote HIPAA packages that promise HIPAA compliance, it's simply just not true, right? The whole point of compliance is that a third party comes in and objectively assesses your infrastructure and says you've passed or you've failed. Your provider is not that person, right? And a lot of folks unfortunately get sort of roped into these situations where they say, hey, my provider gave me a couple of check boxes that showed I had data encryption and that my policies and procedures were intact and all this stuff, but at the end, they think they're HIPAA compliant or not, right? So it's very important that you are realistic about the situation. You're working with a vendor who admits this to you off the bat, right? Which is, look, we're going to be the folks architecting your solution. We have HIPAA compliant. We have HIPAA based reference architectures, but you will not be compliant until you pass an audit. And you're going to want to work with a vendor who's going to iterate interactively with you as you go through an audit, so that if you do need to tune things a little bit, they're very flexible. You don't want these sort of rigid packages that are sold as compliance as a service. So the other thing you need to look out for is, the level of compliance that you're being promised, right? Or at least that the details that have been associated with your cloud have been mapped to specific, HIPAA requirements, and ostensibly these are good and you're going to pass your audit. It may not be as compliant as you think, and this is why you want to work with a vendor who has in-house expertise, who has engineers who have passed HIPAA audits in the past, who know exactly what they're doing. Right? You don't want to work with someone who said, well, I read the HIPAA body of standards last night, and we've got some good sysadmins. They've never passed a HIPAA audit. We think you're compliant. That's not going to be good enough, because if you fail an audit, it's going to be expensive and time-consuming to do it again. So you really want to work with a vendor who has products and services that have been battle tested, have been through the full gauntlet. And another thing you want to make sure of is that you don't go backwards when you sign with a vendor, right? You want to make sure that when you sign with a new MSP or cloud provider that you haven't increased your attack surface, right? You haven't decreased your compliance adherence. And this is something that the only way you're going to be able to do this or to verify this is if you have experts in-house, or you have a third-party expert who's coming in to basically go through your environments and see what you actually have. I mean, a lot of vendors who have quote-unquote HIPAA packages do things like store your data unencrypted on shared backup servers, or do things like transmit data in plain text between application endpoints when that is essentially a violation when those data streams include EPHI, right? So you want to make sure you're working with somebody who's increasing the compliance adherence and security policies, or efficacy of your security policies. And a little bit about support. This is huge, and I want to stress this. It's not enough that your vendor is going to give you HIPAA compliance and a great security strategy and best practices. You also need to couple that with all the other things that are critical to running your business. So things like application high availability, caching optimization, database high availability, DDoS mitigation, application engineering expertise, right? These are all things that, while not specifically or explicitly defined in the HIPAA body of statutes that you need, if you don't have the stuff and you go down, or your application is slow, or your cloud breaks and it's unreliable, it's not going to matter how secure and compliant you are. You're going to be looking for another provider, and then you're going to have to start the whole process again. So it's very critical that you couple amazing support capability with HIPAA compliance when you're evaluating vendors, because you do not want to have to move for a reason that is not related to HIPAA, right? And this is a big one: cost. It can be expensive, right? So at Lightcrest, we pride ourselves on giving our customers the model that makes the most sense for them, not the model that nets us the most money in the short term, right, or the long term for that matter. The way we've packaged our hyper-converged private cloud product, Kahu, is you can get our product either in the OpEx or the CapEx model. Most clouds you're going to be renting forever. Public cloud for sure you're going to be renting forever. And in private clouds, depending on your vendor, you might have only OpEx available to you. You might have CapEx in some areas. But something that you should be very wary of is being locked into costly proprietary models, right? Where you're running on VMware and then you're beholden to VMware for VMware licensing, or Cisco UCS, and it just gets more and more expensive as you scale. So you really want to work with a vendor who's aligned with you on long-term relationships and not short-term, not short-term upsell opportunities. So what you can do now. We kind of, from an action standpoint, if you're in the process of evaluating vendors for a new cloud initiative for HIPAA compliance, or a cloud initiative that may require some audit in the future where security is of paramount concern, really do your homework and ask yourselves the same questions we've been talking about. Do you have a risk register? Do you have deep insights into your existing security policies, and do you have a good handle on your attack surface? Do you have in-house resources that are good at this stuff? Does it make sense to really put the burden of getting HIPAA compliant clouds on your in-house team, and it may not, right? So you really want to look at not just the cost and security implications of the product, right? The actual cloud product you're going to get, but you also want to look at the capabilities of your own internal teams and say, maybe we should offload the expertise and services to another vendor. So obviously Lightcrest is available to you guys if you have any questions or you want to see what our products and services can do for you. But we're really here to be giving you educational feedback. We're not here to sling you products and services. So really do your homework. And this kind of speaks to some of that, right? So think of your cloud provider as a partner, not a vendor. You don't want a sort of black box where in goes money, out comes cloud licenses, right? Or in goes money, out comes a tier 1 support queue where any request that goes above and beyond restart my VMs is essentially non-answered, right? So you want to team up with somebody who's essentially an extension of your team. The way that we do that at Lightcrest is we have this concept of what's called YPE, or your personal engineer. And what that is essentially a pod of architects and engineers that are assigned to you specifically based on your technology stack. So someone running Java Tomcat, Postgres, and Varnish will get a different YPE pod than say someone running .NET, C#, and SQL Server. And that has real implications for HIPAA compliance because the security requirements for different applications are different, right? And you want to make sure that if your developers don't know the answer, that's not where the buck stops. It has to get escalated up to your vendor, and ideally your partner, who is going to drive that to resolution for you on your behalf. And really make sure that you're, again, not getting a cookie cutter solution, right? Again, these sort of turnkey, turn the key and you're HIPAA compliant is not realistic. You're going to get a solution that is bespoke to your business requirements, and you need to couple that bespoke cloud environment with a vendor who can back that up with expertise. So make sure that you're getting a bespoke environment. And final slide here, I want to just touch on this a little bit. We talked a lot about implications of private versus public cloud. I do want to mention that hybrid clouds do provide a lot of benefit for folks with volatile workloads, volatile traffic levels, and there's a lot of DR and business continuity applications of hybrid cloud that are important. So when we're talking about, private cloud is ideal for security, it is. That said, if you have certain use cases where you need to temporarily burst and consume public cloud resources, it is possible to achieve secure HIPAA compliant environments where you have a hybrid architecture. And Lightcrest historically has provided a lot of expertise and consulting around providing solutions that are based on hybrid cloud architectures where private clouds serve up the steady state ongoing workloads, and hybrid clouds provide temporary application bursting. And it's important to make sure that you do not violate your HIPAA compliance in a hybrid model, because as soon as you go hybrid, you have that much more attack surface to worry about, that much more infrastructure to control, but it is doable. So we just don't rule out hybrid cloud if it's something that could be interesting for your business, and if you don't know if hybrid cloud is something that could be valuable to you, we can Lightcrest can definitely help you guys out with that. So that's pretty much it for this presentation. I want to say thank you to everybody on the call, and certainly we're excited to learn about your experiences and journey into secure and compliant clouds. At this point, we'd just like to open the floor for any questions. If you have any questions, feel free to use the GoToMeeting questions box, and we'll get them answered in short order. So yeah, thank you for your time today. So one of the questions asked, this is a great question. aren't cloud virtual machines protected from each other on the public cloud? So it depends at what layer you're talking about, right? Public cloud providers like AWS, Azure, et cetera, are doing everything they can to build, ostensibly secure infrastructure, right? And while you can use things like VPCs to isolate your networks, while you can do things like, set up, private IP space in the public cloud dedicated to hosts, things like that. Yes, that does provide one more layer of security for sure. That said, when your infrastructure is shared, it doesn't really matter how much logical security layers are on top of it if one of those virtual machines is compromised, right? So let's say you've got VMA and VMB. VMA has great security policies, VMB does not. VMA gets compromised. They're sharing the same hypervisor. Well, a couple of things can happen. One is if VMA is compromised, it's possible for that VM to compromise the underlying, or the attacker on that VM to compromise the underlying hypervisor and blow away or compromise the data in the other VM, right? So that's one possibility. The other possibility is there might not be a data breach, but as soon as that VM is compromised and they start doing things like building a botnet or starting a denial of service attack or distributed denial of service attack, every other VM in that hypervisor is going to be rendered useless, right? Because the traffic will be completely consumed. So, or the bandwidth will be completely consumed. So it's still not quite as good, right? You can see that as long as you're sharing infrastructure, you're going to be impacted one way or another by somebody else's shoddy security work. So. Any other questions? All right, guys, we're going to wrap up the webinar. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email me or Thornton. The contact information will be in the follow-up, and we're looking forward to speaking to all of you. So thank you so much.